Are live. Thank you for joining us today. Recently, I've been doing a series looking into the origins of Islam, looking at various different influences, including some pagan influences. The Muslim response hasn't been, oh, well, you're wrong about this suggestion because of A, B, and C. The Muslim response has been, oh, look at you Christians. You're the ones who copied pagan religions. So today I'm going to be joined by Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy, and we're going to look at some of these claims. Let me open us with a quick word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with fellow believers and unbelievers from all around the world. I already see a couple Muslims in the chat, and we ask that anyone watching today, whether they are Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, approach the material with an open mind, that they not simply stick to their ideas that they already had, but they look at the evidence and see where the evidence leads. We ask that you guide our discussion today and prevent us from error. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Give a quick introduction here. We are working on a fixed time schedule today, so we will try to be brief, but I want to give people a chance to join up. And also, a lot of you probably are aware of Inspiring Philosophy, but some of you probably aren't. I personally highly recommend the channel. Amazing content, very thorough research, very high-level academic points pointed out, not just the standard entry-level apologetics. So definitely check that out. So Michael, why are you a Christian?
I think the evidence points us in that direction. I think, especially when it comes to the resurrection argument, that was pretty convincing for me. No other religion, like Islam, for example, has something like the resurrection argument, where you can argue for the religion from an historical case based on evidence. You just have to rely on the private revelations of some guy. Mormonism, Islam, various other beliefs as well, like Zoroastrianism. So that was very convincing for me, and that's why I'm a Christian.
Excellent. I actually like to word the question exactly that way to allow people to give an apologetic reason, and that's actually the same answer I would give, is I'm a Christian because it's true. That's where the evidence points to. Why did you start a YouTube channel?
I started a YouTube channel because it was like 2011, and there wasn't a lot of good apologetic content on YouTube at the time. So at the time, I was working a nighttime security job. I just sat in a trailer for 8 hours, and so I had a lot of time on my hands. So I decided, I could make a couple videos. And I was only going to do about 13 or 14, and then it just sort of snowballed. So here I am now.
Awesome. And what is the focus of your channel for those who don't know?
It's defending a Christian worldview from all various aspects. Right now I'm doing a bunch of stuff on the Old Testament, doing things on Exodus, evidence for that. I'll get back to New Testament later this year, but I just tackle it from philosophy, historicity, science, every aspect I can probably do.
Excellent. And we do have Idol Breaker in the chat. He has been recently enlightening me about all his amazing theories of Tammuz, and we'll get to those shortly, featuring some of his comments. I do have one comment from a Christian that I'd like to share. Topics like these are commonly said by Muslims. They need to be addressed, as the Muslims or others will use these against Christians who are not aware of it, who are not well educated. And I think that comment is right on. As Christians, we're not afraid of the evidence. We believe that the evidence backs our position. We'll start with a couple general comments before we get to specific ones, or general questions before we get to some specifics that have been left on my channel. So just before we dive into specifics, can you tell us the academic standing of Jesus myth type theories, and also the idea that Christianity is primarily copied from pagan religions?
Yeah, the Jesus mythicism is not taken seriously by academia, to be honest. There are a few scholars like Richard Carrier, Robert Price that are Jesus mythicists, but they don't hold any sort of academic position at like a university where they're teaching, because it's just not taken seriously in academia. I remember one time I saw Richard Carrier boast there's like 8 scholars around the world that are Jesus mythicists or are sympathetic to it, and I was like, wow, oh boy, like that's not a lot. I mean. That's, there are thousands of scholars. You got 8. Whatever. In terms of the idea that Jesus's life and ministry, death, and resurrection is somewhat copied from a pagan deity like Tammuz, I can't find a scholar that takes that seriously. There just isn't. There, this is not something that's generally accepted in academia. And when you get into like the really early sources, you see why. There's just no evidence there. You'll find blogs, websites claiming it, and you check the sources that they sometimes use, and it doesn't really check out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with these claims from, previously talking to atheists before I got interested in Islam, and it's just shocking how many atheist blogs act like these are perfectly acceptable theories, and it just goes to show that for many atheists, it has nothing to do with an intellectual objection, because if it did, they would not be accepting such ridiculous theories.
Yeah, and I'll quote for some experts here tonight, like Trygve Medinger, Jan Osman. I mean, this just isn't taken seriously by scholars. I mean, especially when it comes to Christmas too, which we can talk about a little bit tonight as well.
Yep, we have the one told says, "I really love your video. I really love the videos by Inspiring Philosophy and yourself."
Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. Go ahead and put up some comments from Muslims that have collected from my channel. These are all were left over on my channel at various times. We'll shortly get to Idol Breaker's comments, but before we get into specific gods, I have a couple general comments. So this was left by A.A. Abrams, a longtime troll who was eventually blocked for insulting someone's children, of all things. He says there are over 16 Messiah-like man gods that were hung on a cross, tree, or pole for salvation for their followers before Jesus. So do you know of any pre-Christian religion that features a crucifixion-like event as central to its theology?
No, because crucifixion was not really popular before the Romans showed up. I mean, there's some possible instances maybe in Persia, but I mean, there's no big crucifixion wasn't a big thing. Like the Romans are the ones who are really using it. They, it was defining how they would torture and execute people. In terms of like prior messiahs or dying and rising, no, none of this is happening. Most scholars today are not convinced there is a dying and rising motif in the ancient world. If you read scholars like Mark Smith, J.Z. Smith, they don't think a lot of these gods died and rose from the dead. Some do. There's a scholar named Trygve Medinger who wrote a book called The Riddle of the Resurrection. And he argues there are some deities that may have died and rise. He argues for Baal, which I would contest, Melkart, and a couple others here and there that may have been. But then he has an epilogue at the end. And let me just quote from the epilogue of his book, page 221. It says that when he says, well, are these dying, he argues for Baal and Melkart, were these dying and rising gods comparable to Jesus? Now, this is like one of the few scholars that argues there were dying and rising gods. And he's in the minority. Do they compare to Jesus even in his view? No. He says the death of Jesus is presented in the source as vicarious suffering, as an act of atonement for sins. The myth of Tammuz has an arrangement with bilocution and substitution, but there is no evidence for the death of a dying and rising god as vicarious suffering for sins. So right there, Tammuz, no evidence he died and wrote for sins or whatnot. There is, as far as I'm aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. The death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. So there's no evidence according to the minority, the minority position. Okay, remember the majority position is that these gods like Baal don't die and rise. The minority position is even saying, yeah, there may have been some dying and rising gods, but they're nothing like Jesus. They're nothing like this at all. So no, sorry, it doesn't work.
Excellent. Even if we go on a broader term, are there pre-Christian religions where human salvation is accomplished by just any sort of death by a god?
No, no, this is just false. It's the ancient pagans were not really thinking in terms of like sin and salvation. They didn't have these same religious ideas that we have today. We're very much influenced from a Christian worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview. But the ancient pagans had an entirely different worldview. They didn't really see sin the same way we did. So it was quite different. They would not have been looking for something like that because their entire worldview was different.
Excellent. So I have another comment along the same lines. He quoted, or he said Jesus rose for the dead, or was quoting me saying Jesus rose from the dead, and then he puts a question mark, LOL, this is fake belief. Before Jesus was even born, there were 16 world savior pagan gods that were dead and resurrected. Among them were Horus, Bacchus, Krishna, Mithra, etc. Jesus was just another addition to these lists. And then he goes on to this claim that Paul invented it because he knew the idea would be popular among the masses.
Oh.
Yeah, so is there any
Oh.
evidence that the masses would be looking for a dead and resurrected savior?
No. No, this was quite radical for its day. No one knew what to do with Christianity. No one really knew how it sort of got going. It came from Jewish ideas of resurrection, obviously, but no Jew was predicting that a Messiah was going to die and rise again in the middle of history. This was quite unique in the ancient world, and we don't have anything to really parallel it to. This is why scholars do not, if you read like Trygve Menninger's book, he just outright says there's nothing like this. You read Jan Osman, same thing. There's just nothing to compare it to.
Excellent. And he does allude to Mithra here, which is the thing that atheists have generally latched onto, that somehow Christianity is a copy of Mithraism. So do you know of any significant similarities between these two religions?
So the only one I can find is that they both worshipped on Sunday. That's it. But at the same time, there are scholars like Salzman, for example, Michel Salzman, who says that the Mithraic use of Sunday postdates Christians. I talk about this in my video on Mithra. So it doesn't really line up. In terms of Mithra being born of a virgin, dying and rising, no, none of that shows up in the sources we have on Mithraism. Now, we don't have any sources from any Mithraic followers from the ancient world because they didn't leave behind any writings that survived. So we have to go on like what Christians said or what other ancient Roman authors said. And they basically believe that Mithra killed a cosmic bull to save the world, sort of similar to if you read the Enuma Elish of Marduk, destroying the god Tiamat to bring order to the cosmos. Same kind of idea. That general gem motif. You see in the Baal cycle as well. Baal defeats the god of Siyam. A god Mithra defeats chaos, the chaotic bull. But nothing, I can find anything comparable to Christianity.
Yeah, and as you kind of alluded to, we don't even really have much evidence of what the beliefs were, and yet somehow we get all these claims like Mithra was born on December 25th, and he had 12 disciples, and just nonsense. It's not supported by any text.
No, it is definitely not.
So we'll now get to a couple comments that talk about Christmas. I know this is a favorite subject of yours.
It is. This sort of like happened by accident. I just got so annoyed with people saying Christmas. Well, I used to think Christmas was pagan. Like, of course it's based on the pagan holidays, but so what? It doesn't mean the same thing now. It's different. And then these legalists, some of them Torah observers, just these absolute legalists, like, you can't set up a tree in your living room because you're bowing to a pagan idol. I'm like, you're an idiot. Like, it's a decoration. So I was so annoyed by that. I just started looking into it, and now I know too much about the origins of Christmas.
So is there any significant aspect of the Christmas holiday that comes from pagan beliefs?
No, there's not a single source, and let me just address the comments here, that says Tammuz was born on December 25th. Not one. There isn't one ancient source that says any pagan deity was born on December 25th before the Christians started using that date for Jesus' birthday. None. The only source that says there was a holiday on December 25th for pagans is the Philocalian calendar, which dates to 354 AD. It says Sol Invictus was on December 25th. That postdates Constantine. That postdates Christians' use. So it could have been like a pagan alternative set up on that day for pagans of the time. Like Christians were using Christmas. Constantine made it quite public. Now the pagans needed their own holiday. So, but we don't have any evidence that it was ever on that date before 354 AD. There's no evidence. So some parties say Saturnalia, but Macrobius says Saturnalia was on December 17th, lasted for 3 days. Science inscriptions say it lasted for about 7 days, so it ended on the 23rd. in earlier times, like the times of Claudius, that kind of time period. No evidence of any pagan holiday on December 25th. The Christians picked December 25th because they thought that a prophet would die on the same day they were conceived, and they believe Jesus died on March 25th. So just count forward 9 months. Bam, December 25th. Now, scholars like Ronald Hutton, who is not a Christian, he is a pagan, I think I remember, not a Christian, says that the Julian calendar does say that the winter solstice was on December 25th, but they didn't have a holiday. It was just a celestial event. They didn't really do anything. They had Saturnalia, then they had the collides of January, January 1st is like a holiday. That was it. They didn't have anything on December 25th. So there's no evidence of a pagan holiday on December 25th before the Christians started using that date.
Excellent. And of course, the related claim you kind of already alluded to, but do you know any god or any important figure of ancient history that was supposedly born on December 25th?
No, Tammuz was not born on December 25th. Nimrod wasn't. Mithra was not either. Horus was not. There are no deities ever said to be born on December 25th. And if anybody says opposite, they're either lying or they have not done any good research. This is easy to debunk. Stop doing your research by Googling blogs that will agree with your conclusion and start looking at ancient sources. If Tammuz was born on December 25th, go back to the ancient sources and show me. Where is it? Is it in the Descent of Inanna? Is it like in certain inscriptions in ancient Babylon? Or, I don't know, Super? Or how about Is it in Eridu? Where is it? Well, it isn't anywhere, because if Tammuz had a birthday, it's been lost to history, because no source has ever mentioned his birthday or that he was born on December 25th. Who's ever saying the opposite is either lying or just doesn't have research, honestly, at this point. Sorry if that's harsh, but I mean, this is what scholars say.
It's true, right? I mean, you can't make a claim that someone was born on a birthday or a specific date when you don't have any evidence for it. I mean, you could just pick any random day you want and make the same claim and be like, oh, see, why is this holiday on this day? Oh, you're copying this god. I mean, you got to actually have a primary source, or you're just making stuff up.
Even if that was the case, that wouldn't mean that's where the Christians got it from. We know how the Christians got December 25th. They calculated it. They said, well, we think he's going to die on the same day he's conceived. Died on March 25th. All right, just count forward 9 months. The pagans had a lot of holidays, and there were different pagans. So like the Persians, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Norse. I mean, they all had a bunch of holidays. So even if Christmas landed on a pagan holiday, that wouldn't mean that it was copied. There are so many holidays that it could have just landed. But ironically, Christmas just happened to land on a day there was no pagan holiday. That's just one of the ironies of history.
Excellent. So we'll now start addressing some more specific claims that we can actually, address it beyond just saying there's no evidence. So we have this claim from Vengeful Avenger. Horus, the son of Cyrus, carried an Ankh cross, later plagiarized by Roman pagan Paulinists. So,
no.
Are there any notable similarities between Jesus and Horus?
There are none. I mean, this is a joke. The Ankh symbol refers to eternal life. You get to exist in the eternal life. Doesn't refer to resurrection. It doesn't return to a physical body in existence on this plane. It refers to a continual life in the afterlife. That was Egyptian mythology. There's no evidence that Paul or any Christian got this from Egypt. They mean two completely different things. It's clear the Christian cross came from Jesus' crucifixion. Use some common sense here. And no scholar takes this kind of connection seriously. It's just made up by people on the internet. Well, it's made up by early mythicists who just didn't know what they were talking about. And now people on the internet put it out there.
So the response here is that Jesus was not born on December 25th.
First of all, I didn't say that. So let's not lie again. I said that the Christians calculated it December 25th. I don't know the day Jesus was born. The Bible doesn't say, because it was not important to the theology. Scholars have proposed things like September 11th, maybe sometime in May. Some have even argued for the December 25th date. I know some Catholics have done that. I don't care, because it's not important to the New Testament theology. We know why Christians chose that date. They calculated it. But it's just a day to remember the incarnation. That's all I needed to know.
And so I think that this is intended to contradict what you said. Every dying and rising God is different. Every death is different. Every resurrection is different. All irrelevant. The commonality is that there's a death and a resurrection.
Well, there isn't. I mean, that's highly debated among scholars. I mean, Mark Smith, for example, doesn't think Tammuz dies and rise. He thinks it's an astralization, like Tammuz becomes like a star kind of thing. Like that's what part of is going on, and it's in regards to the vegetation cycles. Tryggve Manager argues that no, these are referring to vegetation cycles or storm cycles. It's about seasonal cycles when it comes to things like Bel or Melkart or Tammuz or Adonis. Maybe he's even skeptical of Adonis, if I remember correctly. These are nothing. These are not death and resurrections. Like there's no deity coming in physical human form and then dying and being buried in a physical grave and then coming back to life in a physical body. These are gods that sort of like maybe die and rise in terms of vegetation cycles, but then their death and resurrections are not interpreted in that sort of way. Like they sort of are like, they go to the underworld for a little while, then they just come back up to the stars and that kind of thing. It's not the same when you get into what they are defining these types of things at. And again, even if scholars like Meniger are right, or it wouldn't even be similar to the Christians, but he's in the minority. Most scholars tend to say, no, these aren't really dying and rising gods.
And then Einald's other comment is if you read the Bible, you read about Baal, Ishtar, and Tammuz started from Nimrod.
Okay, yeah, you didn't get that from the Bible because the Bible doesn't say that nonsense. This comes from Alexander Hislop, a fundamentalist Scottish preacher who wrote a book called The Two Babylons and didn't know a clue of what he was talking about. Made up a bunch of stuff about Nimrod being married to Semiramis, which is not in any ancient historical source, and Tammuz apparently being their child and them being a trinity. Utter nonsense. No scholar takes that work seriously. Nimrod is not mentioned in ancient Babylonian sources. He's never said to be the father of Tammuz. Baal and Ishtar and Tammuz are not said to be a trinity. Okay. Or not said to be like grouped at all. Ishtar is from Mesopotamia. Baal is from Ugarit, Canaan, that kind of region. Baal Hadad specifically. Tammuz is also from Mesopotamia, but these three are never put together in sort of forms of a trinity. Tammuz and Ishtar are married. Specifically, it's Dumuzi and Inanna and the Descent of Inanna. That's it. Baal's not associated with them at all. Again, this kind of crap comes from Hislop, not from scholars. It doesn't come from the Bible either.
All right. So Airway responded, it doesn't have to be the same.
Okay. Let me just address this. This is a correlation causation fallacy. You just don't get to say, oh, I found that God, it kind of goes away and comes back. It's just like the Christians. Are you kidding me? If you want to show a correlation to Christianity, you want a connection to Christianity, you got to show that correlations are more than just general assumptions. You're committing basically a vague generalization. Then you got to show actual connections. Is there evidence of literary borrowing? Is there evidence that the Christians were aware of this and they wanted the no? There's no evidence of that. There's a great paper written by a scholar named Stephen Hidgmans titled "The Sun That Did Not Rise in the East." And what he's doing in this paper is he's arguing that some earlier scholars thought the Roman deity Sol was basically a version of the Syrian sun deity. They just sort of took a Syrian sun deity and made it their own. He says that this was based on vague correlations, vague generalizations, and just jumping to conclusions. And he shows from archaeological evidence that's probably not the case. It's that the Roman sun god was a distinct Roman deity that existed in Italy. It's just because it shared some similarities with the... I'll get to Justin Martyr in a second, because that's also a bad argument by people who've not read Justin Martyr's First Apology. I have, like 3 or 4 times now. But back to Hidgmans. Just because there's correlations with Assyrian sun deity doesn't mean they copy. You got to show direct evidence of literary borrowing, and there isn't any. Same with, it comes to the New Testament. Just because you could find, Jesus does miracles, other pagan deities do miracles. Coincidence? Yes. You got to show more than that. You got to actually show there was a literary connection here, or there is evidence of the Christians using these texts. We don't have that, and this is why scholars don't take this seriously. In terms of Justin Martyr, it's people have not read Justin Martyr's Apology. And when I was debating David Fitzgerald, I asked him if he read Justin Martyr's First Apology. He said no. I was shocked because he uses Justin Martyr in his books. Justin Martyr is not saying that the pagans do exactly the same thing that the Christians do. Justin Martyr is facing persecution and death. He is terrified. And he's pleading with the Romans. He's like, look, don't kill us. Stop persecuting us. You don't kill the people that worship Dionysus. Can't you just look at them? Can't you just look at us the same way you look at them? Look, why can't you look at us like the same way, Romulus says, we have a son of God, he was a son of Mars. Can we just be like that? And then he goes on to also say, you call us atheists. Well, you also call these other philosophers atheists, but you're not persecuting them and you didn't persecute them. Why are you persecuting us? He's making very vague general assumptions by his own admission to just say, please don't murder us. This is a plea to not die. He's not saying clearly, like there's a clear similarity here. No, he's saying, look, if you have to do anything, guys, just look at us like you look at the people who worship Dionysus, or look at us like the people, those atheist philosophers, because, you call them atheists, you call us atheists, but you're not going to kill those atheist philosophers. Why? That's what he's doing. And then he even goes on to say that the reason, what's sort of happening in these pagan cults is Satan went through the Old Testament to try to find parallels and then mimic them. But then Justin Martyr says Satan didn't do a good job because they really don't match. Like these pagans really don't match. So people have not read Justin Martyr's first apology, and they cite like these cherry pick quotes out. He's pleading for his life. So he's saying he's like, please don't murder me. Just look at us like you look at the atheist philosophers, or you look at the people who worship Dionysus, please. And then he's saying, I'm not saying these similarities are really great. It's obviously the devil was trying to impersonate the Old Testament. He did a bad job because the similarities aren't even that good. But please just treat us like them anyway so you don't kill us. That's what's happening here. And of course, it didn't work because he's Justin Martyr. So he was martyred.
Fassel, one of his comments is up on the screen now, the one he's referring to here. He says, that's odd. My second point quotes Justin Martyr. That's not odd at all. It's almost like you didn't actually do any research on the primary sources and you got this from a third party because everyone just says the same thing without anyone checking up on it.
My response to this is simply, are Christians atheists? Because that's what Justin Martyr says in his apology. He's like, look, just treat us like you treat atheist philosophers. We're like them in your eyes, just as long as you don't murder us. It's like that's his point. Are Christians atheists? If the answer is no, then you're obviously going to accept that because there's just because Romans called Christians atheists when they first started going because they rejected the Roman pantheon, that doesn't mean Christians are atheists. You would obviously accept that's a way, way too much of a generalization to say that Christians are atheists. Well, that's what he's doing in his apology constantly. So, read it. Just sit and read it for one afternoon. I promise you, you won't. This is why scholars don't use this as any sort of evidence of pagan connections, because they've read it.
On a different note here, Airway says that kick against the pricks is literally a quote from Dionysus, which
I don't know what kick against the pricks is. What is he talking about?
Oh, okay. I'll actually answer this one then. So in Acts, Jesus appears to, I believe it's Paul, and says, why are you kicking against the pricks? Which is a quote from a famous play, but it had entered into common usage by that time period.
Oh, right. Yeah, now I remember now. Yeah, it's just like a phrase.
Yeah, and it was just in common usage that, it's just an expression. Like, we will say things that come from Shakespeare's plays, and it's not like we're actually quoting the play. They're just things that have entered into common usage.
Well, it's like, I remember I've read articles where they compare like Barack Obama to Abraham Lincoln. And sometimes Barack Obama would borrow phrases from Abraham Lincoln's speech. Does that mean does that mean Barack Obama didn't exist? Just a copy of Abraham Lincoln. Like, this is the level of reasoning you get from mythicists. They don't really think beyond that.
Definitely. So we'll get back to the specifics. Our good friend Idlebreaker here is obsessed with Tammuz for whatever reason. I don't know why, because this is not someone people normally go to when they're trying to say Jesus is a copy of another god. But he says that the Vine's Expository Dictionary says worshippers of Tammuz used a cross as a symbol, and he, remarking on my stream on the origins of Islam, he said, you talked for 3 hours and you mentioned Baal and Istar, but you didn't reference Tammuz or Dumuzi or Jesus. Shake my head. Pagan Trinity mentioned, but didn't go into Tammuz. Almost like it has nothing to do with it.
Okay, you're citing a century-old work that has been, this is a very, very old work. W.E. Vines. I mean, we've come a long way since then in terms of scholarship. Why don't you read J.Z. Smith, Mark Smith, Trygve Mettinger, even Stephen Langdon, who's even a little bit more recent than this? None of them say this crap. Shammuz was a shepherd type deity, so sometimes he's depicted holding like a shepherd's like staff, and sometimes it can be shaped like in like cross like forms. Sometimes it can be seen as like a scepter, but it's never a cross like a crucifixion type thing. It's just a general shape that's used in a lot of religious stuff. Like this is way too vague. Like crosses are used in a lot of like. Do you think telephone poles are based on the cross? Like it's just a common shape. Like what are you doing?
Yeah, for real. I mean, I've seen the I didn't bring the picture, so I can't call it up. But I've seen the picture that supposedly shows Tammuz using a cross, and it's like he's just holding a staff that happens to
Yeah,
have a cross shape in it. It's not like
that's
it's
all it is. He's a
yeah,
shepherd deity. So yeah,
yeah, a little silly to say that has something to do with the Christian cross, and it has a pretty obvious origin. We don't
what
need to like go some strange place. And
what I like about this comic though, is this guy wearing a tinfoil hat? Easter Ishtar? No, that's just false. First of all, it was called Pascha, outside of any sort of English Germanic language. The reason why it's called Easter in English is because it was used during the months of Ostaromanoth. Uh, and so they just said it's the Ostaromanoth festival. It's like us, we use the 4th of July. We call it based on the month it was in. So Pascha in English speaking worlds became Easter because it was in Ostaromanoth. Now, some say that was based on a deity called Istara. I don't think that deity existed. Most scholars today, I think, don't, because he only references it into St. Bede. And St. Bede is making an inference based on limited data that he had no evidence of. We have no evidence of any goddess named Ostara, but we have no evidence Easter is connected to Ishtar. There's not one scholar on planet Earth that would say that. And if you took that into any historian, they'd laugh at you because this is just nonsense. It was Pascha in any sort of like ancient Roman setting. And then it only becomes Easter centuries later in English-speaking world because it was based on that month. It landed in that month.
yes, definitely. He has the follow-up comment here
Oh,
that
Zeus is Baal? So the answer to that is yes and no. Oh, no, the Tammuz worshippers wore a towel system.
yeah,
What source? What's their source? Where? Like, we have so little evidence on Tammuz worship because it comes from ancient Mesopotamia that's highly fragmented. I've never seen any of this in any sort of scholarship I've seen. So I want to know this. I don't want to know what website you got it from. I'd like to know the ancient source you got it from. Is it in the Enuma Elish? Is it in the Atalapatapa? How about any sort of Ugaritic inscription, ancient Babylonian inscription? Is it in the Nippur inscriptions? Where is it? I mean, but back to this other comment, Zeus is Baal. That depends on who you're reading, because the ancient pagans did a lot of syncretism. They syncretized their deities with what they found elsewhere, and later authors would syncretize Zeus and Baal because they were both storm deities. They also combined Zeus with Thor. They did this everywhere they went. This was a pagan practice. Christians didn't do this though, for obvious reasons, because it would have been idolatry. But the pagans did this. They would try to find, who's cool in Egypt that looks like our deity? They're the same guy. Yeah. Moving on. They did the same thing so Zeus looked like Baal. They were both storm deities. They were both kings. Ugaritic Baal cycle has Baal becoming king. So they just combined them. They did that quite often.
Lisa, look, gave a super chat. Jesus is God. Jesus heart us. Thank you very much for that super chat. Oh, we got even more humor here for you.
Again, this guy's not done any research because there is no evidence of any Ishtar or Ostara eggs ever in any ancient source or medieval source. Eggs start to show up in late Middle Ages. They most likely associate with Lent. So you don't eat a lot of meat during Lent. You save up all the eggs, and you can hard boil them. So when Lent is over, you have a big festival with all your eggs. That's probably where they come from. We have no really evidence of any of them really showing up in terms of an Easter celebration before that. They're probably mostly associated with Lent. You save the eggs by hard boiling them. Then Easter comes, Lent's over, you have a big celebration, you have a whole bunch of eggs. Just connects it. Same with Easter rabbit. Doesn't really show up, I think, until the late 1500s. Germany, maybe. Like, it's very, very late. And it's a hare. It's the Easter hare, which is not technically the same animal.
Excellent. We have some dispute about your claims about the Ankh here. It says that it's very similar to the cross, not just in the shape, but also in the property. Add the fact that the shape of the cross was never even specified in the New Testament. And there you go, proof positive.
Yeah, again, once again, this is correlation, not causation at best, and no scholar would take this seriously. Again, there's no. This sort of like debunks their whole claim, though, because there's no text that say that they, in the New Testament specifically, that says they got it from Egypt. Clearly, the Christian cross shows up because they were worshiping the fact that they were, very excited. They were very happy that Jesus rose from the dead, but he also died on the cross. So the cross became a symbol of the Christians because of that, and they wore it proudly. Even though in ancient world the cross was considered a sign of shame and humiliation, but they said, what the world tried to shame us with is God's victory, is the cross. So again, this is like Stephen Hidgman's argument. Just because there's a Syrian sun deity and a Roman sun deity doesn't mean they copied each other.
Have a different claim here, and then we'll get to
no,
some
it is
more.
Not. No,
Osiris.
Go ahead, reread it.
Osiris, of course, is explicitly described in pre-Christian pyramid inscriptions! Exclamation point.
Okay, do these guys, have they read any scholarship on this, or do they just throw this stuff out, thinking like it's going to... Okay, no, nothing says this. Let me pull up some quotes here from scholars like J.Z. Smith, for example. Again, Tryggvi-Medinger, even in his book, says this just isn't the case. Medinger says Osiris rose to continue life in the netherworld, and the general connotations are that he was God of the dead. This is in page 175 of The Riddle of Resurrection. J.Z. Smith says in Encyclopedia of Religion, in no sense can Osiris be said to have risen in the sense required by the dying and rising pattern. In no sense can the dramatic myth of his death and reanimation be harmonized to the pattern of dying and rising gods. The repeated formula, rise up, you have not died, whether applied to Osiris or a citizen of Egypt, signaled a new permanent life in the realm of the dead. What is he basically saying? Well, it's an equivocation fallacy. What resurrection meant in Egypt is not what the Jews meant or the Christians meant by resurrection. Their word, Egyptian word, that we translate as resurrection, meant you're going to die and continue to live in the afterlife. That's all it meant. It did not mean you're going to return to physical body here. Osiris never returns to this plane of existence. He never rises from the dead. He's a dead deity. This is why he's green in ancient texts. He's a corpse. He's dead. He's the god of the dead in the underworld. He doesn't ever return to life. And
Excellent.
Don't take my word for it. Take the scholars. Mark Smith, J.Z. Smith, Tryggvi-Medinger. They all say this.
Yeah, and these arguments are usually devoid of any primary source text, which is why I think facile for at least going to source text. So we'll spend probably the rest of the time talking about his quotes here, because at least he gives us something to address.
Yeah, and this is an interesting. I got a paper on this first one here, of the Egyptian one.
Yeah, he's going to claim, he has a number of points, but the first one, and this is the one that has most of his sources, is that the Trinity is a common concept throughout the region. And then he cites a number of specific examples, beginning with Egypt, claiming a quote from a hymn that says, all gods are three, Amun, Re, and Ptah.
Well, I like how he stops there with the quote. Doesn't going to continue at all. So let me read the rest of the quote. All gods are three, Amun, Ra, and Ta, whom none equal. He hides his face as Amun. He appears as the face Ra. His body is Ta. That sound like Trinitarian, or does it sound like modalism? Like, Jan Osman, in a paper, Monotheism, Polytheism, says this. We easily discern here the three dimensions of polytheistic theology. Name, cosmic appearance, cultic embodiment, and a statue dwelling in a temple, ruling a city. These three dimensions, however, are encompassed and transcended by a God who is referred to as only he. Amun is just a name screening the true and hidden name of God. So basically what he's saying is that this is like all these, there's just one God and all the gods are like parts of him. It's like partialism, or it can be modalism, depending on how you read that one. And my favorite thing about this Laden hymn, you didn't look it up because it dates to the 3rd century AD. Post-hates Christianity, guys. So can't use it. How could the Christians get it unless they were time travelers? So no, once again, doesn't work because this is post-hates Christianity. But again, this is not even Trinitarianism. This is either modalism or partialism when you read it in text and read what scholars have to say about it.
Excellent. He claims a trinity from Babylonian religion of Nana, Shamash, and Ishtar. He doesn't give a source for this one.
No, Nana is the moon god. Shamash is the sun god, and Ishtar is a fertility god. And there's no evidence they were ever a trinity.
All right. In a follow-up comment, when I was talking to him, he did say that Hinduism is the one he thinks is the strongest connection to Christianity.
Oh.
He says that Hinduism has the concept of Trimuta,
Mm-hmm.
in which the supreme god Brahman is said to manifest in three forms: Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And then he cites a specific text.
Yeah, well, he's got more avatars actually, and that's what they are. These are like modes. It's like modalism. This is not Trinity. It's like the one deity sort of transitions for different parts. Like, like Shiva is like the god who's supposed to like be the destroyer. So when the end comes, the god is going to like turn into Shiva and destroy everything. It's more like modalism. But again, a lot of these texts post-date Christianity. So, for example, Dr. Edward Bryant notes a lot of these stories about, like, for example, Krishna tend to date to like maybe the 4th, 6th century. We don't have a lot of evidence of them going back before that, and let alone the Christians would have been able to be aware of them. I mean, these weren't being circulated in ancient Judea, where they would have detested such texts because they were pagan. Oh, so the Christians, so like, Peter, or, one of the disciples was so wealthy, he traveled all the way to India, copied their text, came all the way back, and was like, you know what, guys, I got a great idea. Like, it strains credulity. It strains, it's so unparsimonious. To have that kind of theory. And it's not even the same as a Trinity, because these are not gods that coexist. These are different forms of like this one deity.
And I'm hesitant to even bring this up, but in defense of this, he cited the legend of Jesus' lost years and him going to India during those years. Yes, that's why I was hesitant to even bring it up.
Again, do these people making these comments wear tinfoil hats? Because there's not a scholar that thinks Jesus went to India. This is like made up by just people that don't know what they're talking about. There are no sources that would indicate that a poor Jewish carpenter from Galilee would have the money to travel to India. You got to remember something about the ancient world too. There were bandits everywhere. That's kind of how Rome got involved in Judea. They had so many bandits. They sort of invited Rome in to help with them at some points. And then Rome was like, we kind of like it here. And so they sort of like took over from there, and they, turned it into like a client kingdom. But yeah, you don't travel a lot because of this problem. There are bandits, there are revolutionaries everywhere waiting to, jump you. And like, people just tend to think the ancients lived exactly like we do, and they could just go wherever they want if they had that little bit of money. No, this is a complicated, long process. You'd have to save up like a life savings to do this kind of thing, and you basically had to be royal or in the military at high ranking to do this kind of stuff. It just didn't happen. Rome sort of revolutionized it by making roads, and so people could travel more. So that's how Paul was able to sort of get around, is like he had these roads he could travel on, and they were protected by Roman guards. But, you're not going to see, anyone going outside of the Roman Empire before like this time period too much. And if they did, they were not expecting to go back. So like, you're going to go to like Persia to preach, and you're just going to have to stay there because it'd be too much to try to get back. Before Rome, you didn't really do a lot of traveling if you were especially poor. And most people didn't do a lot of traveling. It was, missionaries did it. People that were, religious type folk did it. Roman soldiers, the rich. But I mean, it was a complicated process to do. Pilgrims would do it. And again, what made it more accessible was Romans made roads. But even at that, a lot of people still did not travel. It was rare. A lot of people just couldn't afford it. They had to work.
Excellent. We can go through the rest of these supposed trinities fairly quickly, I think. So supposedly the Greek religious system has a trinity in the goddess Hecate, which is described as the triple-headed and the goddess of three ways, according to a Greek magical papyri.
No, she's just like, she's a three-headed goddess, or sometimes she's put as like three bodies. Like, it's
like literally three heads, right?
Yeah, it's like three faces of like one god. Like, that's not, you just can't see things that are three and go, oh, that's the Trinity.
Roman beliefs apparently venerated Diana as the Diva Triformis, which means three-formed gods. A Roman poet once wrote, "O three-formed goddess, to thee I dedicate the pine tree."
Again, it's not a three. Like, what does this even mean? This is just it's not a Trinity. It's, if anything, it's modalism.
Yeah, I don't know either. And he says that northwestern European tribes worshipped a god of three female deities. No source for that but I fail to see why
Um,
this would even be remotely relevant to begin with.
we know very little on Northwestern European tribes prior to Christian influence takeover. Mainly because they didn't leave behind any sources, and what we know about them is generally from the Roman sources, and I don't know any sources that mention this.
And I mean, it should be common sense that whatever their beliefs were, they wouldn't have any influence on the Christians in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Persia supposedly has a triad in Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and Anahita
Yeah,
because of royal.
these are servants of Ahura Mazda. They're not like God. Like,
And the text cited just names those three things and says, "Protect me." Am I binding against evil or building against evil? But I mean, this is a point I made to Fazal, is that, yeah, you can find instances of three, you can find instances of two and four and five and every other number. You actually have to show that it has some similarity to the Trinity, not just say that someone once associated three gods together.
mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to do more than this. This is not.
So after citing these examples, he says that the Greek philosopher Aristotle had to say that the magical significance of the number three, just as the Pythagoreans say the whole and all things are delimited by the number three, for end, middle, and beginning have the number of the whole, which is that of the triad. Wherefore we also use this number also in the worship of gods, taking it from nature as a law of it. So apparently all these systems all believed in some sort of three as a magical number, and that's why Christians came up with the Trinity.
Yeah, where's the connection here? Like, there's no connection. This is not saying that they worshipped a god that was three persons and all one. Each was fully God. It's just saying that they used three in worship. Like, it's talking about dimensions, for example. It's talking about end, middle, and beginning. Like, their time is divided into these kind of three things. Like, that's all he's talking about. You read the context.
Yeah. So before we get to his second point, I asked Airway for a source for his claim and about Osiris. Oh, well, this is the claim. On Isis and Osiris 39 and 42, Osiris dies on the 17th of Ather, and concluding day of the full moon is raised on the 19th, 2 days later. And he claims that this comes from pyramid texts 1684a, 1685a, 1700, so forth.
No, nothing I have found any evidence of whatsoever. That just isn't in there. If he's talking about Isis and Osiris, that's a work from Plutarch. And Plutarch is, again, writing after the Christians.
And Mary, Too Many Marys, made that exact point, if I can find it. Plutarch was after Christ, so in all likelihood, Airway didn't actually know where this came from, but Too Many Marys did know where this story came from.
Yeah, it's Plutarch. Plutarch is writing. The Christians didn't use Plutarch. He hadn't written his stuff yet. I mean, he's writing it to the end of the first century. It's sort of like the beginning of the second kind of time. Like, he's not. Again, like we're and we don't see a lot of the stuff he gives us in earlier sources. So he's either making inferences or getting it from sources we lost. No evidence that Christians were aware of them. We have no evidence. We don't really have a lot of what he was getting this from. He may have been making inferences on what he thought based on oral traditions and sort of elaborating on things. But I mean, no evidence that Christians were aware of this.
Probably the last comment we'll take from Idlebreaker. He said, the earlier you guys said Ishtar didn't exist, but the Jews worshipped her and Baal in the Bible. Did you make that claim first? And
no,
did the
Ishtar
Jews worship her in the Bible?
Well, I mean, rebellious Jews worshipped an array of gods like Asherah, Baal, and this is what Elijah is contesting against in the Old Testament. I mean, of course they dealt with that, but Tammuz was not their son. So Baal, Ishtar is Inanna and is married to Tammuz in the Descent of Inanna, for example, that ancient text. In the Sumerian king list, Dumuzi is the son of Lugal Banda, who reigned at Uruk, who has Dumuzi or Tammuz, a fisherman, and then is the father, and then Dumuzi or Tammuz is the father of Gilgamesh, in the Sumerian king list. These are about the rulers of Uruk. In other texts, Tammuz and Inanna are married. But no, there's no text I know of that Ishtar is ever married to Baal. I think Baal might be married to, in some texts, his sister Anat, but not Ishtar.
Excellent. So we'll get back to the points of Fassel now. He says that Greek and Roman religions are filled to the brim with tales of gods procreating with human women and begetting god men, and then he cites some examples. Is that what Christians believe about Jesus, first of all?
No. I mean, this sort of debunks his whole point, because God didn't come down and procreate with Mary. It was divine, like without any. She was a virgin. Like there was no sex involved, guys. Like, come on, this actually debunks your whole point.
And then he has this claim here at the end. This statement of Jesus being the beginning of the good news can also, in turn, be mirrored in by another Roman dictator, Augustus. The birthday of the God, and by the following quote, "The birthday of the God has been for the whole world the beginning of good news concerning him." And then he gives a reference to a calendar. So do you find Mark 1:1 to be a direct parallel to this calendar?
No, because it's just a general phrase from the ancient world. You talk about, like, the good news of whoever this was. Like, it's like comparing speeches of like presidents. You're going to find similarities and overlap. It doesn't mean one was copying the other. Think about how many presidents have said "my fellow Americans." All of them in the recent years. I mean, doesn't mean like, oh, one of them was clearly a copy of the other. Like, this is ridiculous logic.
Oh, and I did miss this point in the middle that Julius Caesar was elevated to the status of deity. Quote, "is the descent of Eris and Aphrodite, the god who has become manifest and universal savior of human life." This is supposedly an inscription from Ephesus.
Yeah, Julius Caesar was turned into a god. Guess what? Jesus wasn't turned into a god. He was God from beginning. Like, he was born as God in flesh and just died as God in flesh. He never had to become anointed a god. Like, there's a lot of stories of humans, like Asclepius, for example, who becomes like a god in later texts. So what? That happened a lot. That's not what the Christians believed. So this doesn't compare. Read the Bible.
Fassel said that your example of politicians using a common phrase is hardly comparable. Actually, I was going to say, your phrase was several words, and this is actually just 2 words. Good news is 1 word, and beginning.
Yeah.
You got 2 whole words in common, but you cited a short phrase of, I don't know, 4 or 5 words, and that's not at all the same thing as these 2 words occurring next to each other in 2 different texts.
And again, correlation is not causation. You want to show a connection, show me an actual causal link. You just cannot scour through text, cherry pick or quote mine out things and go, clearly the Christians got it from here. Like, this is not what historians do. You're not doing what historians do. You're doing what conspiracy theorists do.
Oh, he did explain why he thinks it's similar, because they both talk about the birthday of Jesus, except is Mark 1:1 actually about the birthday of Jesus?
No. So again, read the Bible.
Yeah. At the start of Mark, Jesus is already fully grown, and the beginning is the start of his public ministry, not the beginning of his life. So actually, you just undermined your own point, because you showed they weren't parallel in any way.
And again, no historian makes this argument. This is conspiracy theory level reasoning. This is not historical analysis you'd see done at an academic university.
Let's see. He goes on. The concept of a human being who is a divine son of God, savior of mankind, and good news was a sort of template that was applied to people of great power and authority. I suppose the examples of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. We've seen that the history of paganism is littered with such examples, and the Christian conception of Jesus was just another incarnate God in a long line of incarnate gods that preceded him. Did any of these rulers was the story that they were incarnate at birth, that they were literally a god that had been incarnated, or were they elevated to the status of God?
They're
That would be
elevated.
my question.
Romulus, Hercules, all of these deities, Asclepius, none of them are born gods that come down. They are offspring of God. They get anointed or get put up, allowed to become gods, kind of thing. Like none of these people are ever, God's like, I'm gonna go be born. Like that would have been embarrassing for these gods like Mars or Zeus, who are these powerful. They're gonna become a baby and have to suckle and live in like a poverty. That would have no ancient pagan would have invented such a thing, because that would have been so embarrassing for them. Why would Zeus get off his throne and go live in a manger or live a human life? Like he would never do such a thing. This is why Christianity is so unique.
And we already addressed this quote from Justin Martyr. Fassel did claim that he said that he did claim that he'd read it, and he said that this quote isn't about atheism. But that wasn't actually your point, right? Your point was the whole work is saying treat us like atheists.
I never said it was about atheism, guys. There's a lot of straw mans being thrown in the comment section. No, I said he does a lot of comparisons. One of them is he compares Christians to atheist philosophers. Likewise, he compares them to other deities being worshipped. And he's like, please don't kill us. Just treat us like you treat them.
Excellent. So his third point is on the death of Jesus. He quotes Matthew, and then he says, and then he quotes the Apostles' Creed, and then he claims that these beliefs mirror an ancient Sumerian myth, the Descent of Inanna, which states, from the great heaven, Inanna sent her mind. On the great below, Inanna abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended in the underworld. And after 3 days and 3 nights has passed, thus let Inanna rise.
How do you pronounce his name?
I think Faisal?
Faisal? You didn't read the Descent of Inanna, did you? Don't lie to me. I know you didn't read it. No, Inanna does not die for 3 days in the Descent of Inanna. She's got a servant with her in the beginning, and she's like, I'm going to go to the underworld and take it. It's going to be mine. I want to claim the throne. So I'm going to descend to the underworld. When I get there, go around and make rounds to the gods for me, because, lament on my behalf. So then we hear of Inanna's descent. She gets down there and she tries to seize the throne, and she gets pronounced dead by the judges there, and they hang her dead body on a hook. Meanwhile, you cut back to her servant. And her servant starts making, and says, after 3 days and 3 nights, Ninkaburu went around and made the laments. Okay, now what does that say? Inanna said, make the rounds for me when I get to the underworld. Cut back to her servant later. After 3 days and 3 nights, she started making the rounds. The 3 days and the 3 nights in Inanna's descent correspond with her journey to the underworld, not how long she was dead. Okay, you got to actually read it. I know you didn't, because if you did, you'd see that. So, in the ancient world, it was a common belief that to get to the underworld, the journey took 3 days and 3 nights. This is what Jonah is about. Jonah in chapter 2 talks about him going down the Sheol, 3 days and 3 night journey. But he's resuscitated. He's brought back to life by God. So he doesn't just stay in the belly of the fish, for example. He goes to the underworld. He dies. So, Inanna did not die for 3 days and 3 nights. Her descent took 3 days and 3 nights to get to the underworld. Then she goes through these 7 gates, and then she's pronounced dead, and we don't know how long she stays dead for.
Yeah, and this particular quote is not actually in the text. Someone has added this arising again part after 3 days and 3 nights.
No, yeah, it's not in the text.
Yeah,
it's from the great heavens and honor. Oh my God, no, it's not. That's not in the text at all. That's not in the Descent of Inanna.
Yeah. So, he says arising after 3 days, question mark, but you want me to believe this is a coincidence? Well, it's not a coincidence. It's because someone made up the text to create this similarity.
First of all, put that back up. She wasn't sacrificed. She was an idiot who wanted to seize the underworld, and she died in the process. Jesus does not descend in the underworld in the Passion narrative. That's an inference made later by Christians. She doesn't rise after 3 days. Again, her journey to the underworld takes 3 days. We don't know how long she's dead, because Ninkaburu is going to go around and make all these rounds. It takes a while. It would probably be longer because the other gods got a journey down there to bring her back to life. And scholars note this was in conjunction with vegetation cycles. She's a fertility god. When she's in the underworld, it's winter. Things are die. She's summer, back, things are growing, that kind of thing. So no, none of this actually corresponds because she wasn't sacrificed. Jesus didn't descend into the world, and she wasn't dead for 3 days. It's not in the text. And yeah, again, correlation is not causation. I can easily do this. You want me to think that Confucius and Socrates are the same guy. Both had disciples, both taught on philosophy, both were hated by the elites. Coincidence? Yes. Sometimes coincidences happen. I can think of numerous historical coincidences. You can think of the fact that when the Mongols invaded Japan, twice, hurricanes stopped them both times. Oh, coincidence. How could a hurricane happen both times? Well, it's what happened. Coincidences happen.
And again, the text doesn't even say that to begin with. Do have a legitimate question from Airway here. This was addressed to you. What would you accept as evidence for adopting pagan concepts? What do we need? So what evidence would you accept to actually back these theories?
All right, good question. So you got to show that correlations are just not generalizations. You got to show things like literary borrowing, like, maybe like Inanna, like let's say we found an ancient text of Inanna. That, she was like being whipped, and then she carried this cross, and she sat on a hill, and then she was nailed to it. That would be a very interesting correlation. You also have to show that the Christians would have been aware of it. Like if it was buried in the sand for, thousands of years and no one knew about it in Jesus' time, that doesn't work either. So you got to show that the correlations are actually, can I share my screen here? I can actually show you what would convince me, because I have this all written out. Let me find okay. I will pull up my screen here. Window. Here's something I've given on a talk before. Can you see that? Yeah. Yep. Okay. Here's what you need to show. Show the correlation between Jesus and pagan gods. Show they are not just hasty generalizations and actually are specific. Show the correlations predate Christianity. When it comes to things like Dionysus, for example, a lot of those postdate Christianity. Show a causal link between the New Testament and pagan literature. So are there literary borrowing? Is it so similar that there's just no way that it could have, the Christians would have been aware of it? So those are the ways you got to show those correlations. Again, no one has actually been able to do that. All these are just generalizations. There's no evidence of causation. Some of these even postdate Christianity, and you also have to show evidence that the Christians would have been aware of these texts. There's no evidence they would have been aware of texts from ancient India, like knowing about texts about apparently the Trimurti. There's no evidence they would have known about the descent of Inanna, because that was buried in ruins for thousands of years. Like, come on, you got to show more than this. You got to show that they would have actually these texts have been circulating in ancient Judea.
Faisal says, comparing coincidence to a natural event, please show me that Inanna was arising and was added to the text. Well, no, that's not how it works. You don't get to make a claim and then make us disprove it. You have to prove that the text actually says that.
Well, Inanna arising was not, I didn't make the claim that Inanna arising was added. Of course, it's a part of the original text. It's nothing like, this Trigman manager knows, this is nothing like Christianity. This is about Inanna. This is about the ancient belief that when a god was in the underworld, that the goddess of fertility was in the underworld, plants died. Nothing grew. So then they came back up, and then they went back down the next year. And they came back up and went back down the next. These are cycles they went through. This is not necessarily the same thing, because again, she goes to the underworld and she's pronounced dead, hung on a hook. They come back, revive her with like certain herbs or water, depending on which text you read, and then she just comes back up, and she's sort of like goes on the cycle where she spends time in the underworld and goes back up, and comes back down, goes back up, comes back down.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I wasn't saying that the quote wouldn't be a possible, not very accurate, but a possible summary of the text. My point was that you're claiming it's a quote from the text, and it's not. You can get the text online. It's not that hard to do. Just go look at the text. It doesn't have the quote that you claimed was a direct quote from the work.
No,
which is what I was saying.
It doesn't say she was dead or rose 3 days later. It does not say that at all. We don't know how long she was dead and hanging on a hook in the underworld.
Absolutely. So I know you wanted to limit this to an hour. I think we could probably get through the other points in 10 to 15 minutes. So your call.
We can keep going for a little bit for now.
All righty. So going back to the claims of Faisal, we have he quotes this controversial passage from Matthew. And this is the one that all skeptics will always point to, the people coming out of their tombs at Jesus' resurrection. Gives a long argument of why it's not historically accurate, which is actually irrelevant, because whether it's historically accurate or not doesn't play into whether or not it was borrowed from something else. So he says that it is not historically accurate, so obviously it must have been borrowed from somewhere. And it just happens that among the then present, I suppose, pagan cultures, the ancient Greeks celebrated a 3-day festival known as Anthestera, during which they believed that the dead came back to life and walked among the living in the cities. The Roman poet Virgil wrote that Julius Caesar was assassinated and there were phantoms of unearthly pallor were seen in the fallen darkness. So what do you say about this as a possible origin of Matthew's resurrection story?
Yeah, first of all, again, no evidence of direct literary borrowing, for example. Mike Licona says that Matthew is just using a literary device. He's basically just saying, like, it's a literary device from the base, saying it's like hell froze over, guys. Like the sun and the moon were black and everyone mourned on the earth and hell froze over and, like that kind of stuff. There were earthquakes and like that kind of stuff. It was earth shattering, basically. And that's just common, happens in the ancient world. They do that kind of stuff. So, like Mike Licona already acknowledges and deals with its literary device. So what?
So Airway followed up about your conditions. And he said, are these your personal conditions, which is ironic since he asked your personal conditions, or the academic conditions? From which scholars this list of conditions taken?
Yeah. No, I did not get it from a direct list. I got it from reading what actual scholars say, like read Maurice Casey on this or read Mark Smith on this. I mean, this is the same kind of reasoning they use. I just sort of put it into an actual list when I gave a lecture on it once.
And then Faisal, this is probably about Matthew. He says, so you agree? Well, no, first of all, we didn't agree. But doesn't that demoralize you in any way, knowing that it is recording a part of your text regardless? So I guess he's saying, that we should be embarrassed by this text, whether or not it's taken from pagan religions.
No, because we are reading it in its ancient cultural context and trying to understand what the authors were getting at. Just because they use idioms and hyperbole, that doesn't mean we're embarrassed by it. We understand the text as actually was written. We don't have the same assumptions Muslims do. We read the text in its cultural context, trying to understand what it's getting at. We don't try to force it to say something it needs to.
Absolutely. So his fourth point is on life being obtained through flesh and blood. He quotes Jesus saying that his blood is real drink and his flesh is real food. And then he tries to compare this to something about Osiris. He says, note the great importance is placed on this ritual, meaning the Eucharist. It has claimed to bestow eternal life, and all this has already had a precedent in the ancient Egyptian cult of Osiris. Osiris was believed to be the god of the dead and the god of resurrection. The body of Osiris was represented by the bread. And here is the quote that proves it. The valley gives you bread from the burial of her father, Osiris.
No, we're talking about grain. Read Medinger's book. He has a whole chapter on Osiris, starting in chapter 167, I think. Osiris and the West Semitic gods. Yeah, Osiris was in some way related to the grain coming back up. So they talked about bread because Osiris, helped the grain grow. There's no evidence of him having some sort of Eucharist ritual either. That's again no evidence of that. That's not what's happening in these texts he's citing. They're talking about how he's making the grain grow. He's also credited with teaching the Egyptians how to make wine. So that's what we see that sort of relation to. No evidence of, again, a Eucharist ritual they did, like occasionally where they'd eat his body and drink his blood kind of thing, like nothing like that. So again, no scholars say that the Christians got the Eucharist from Osiris. Medinger is I don't agree with Medinger on everything, but I'm citing him to show how bad these arguments are. Like, I don't agree with Medinger when he says Baal was a dying and rising god. I agree more with Mark Smith on that.
Yeah, there was a comment earlier. I'm not sure who said it. As why do you keep quoting the same scholars? And well, the answer is that most people don't even take this seriously enough to respond to it.
I'm the one quoting scholars. These guys aren't. So maybe they should actually quote one. Give me an academic source. A peer-reviewed work that's by a credible historian.
Yeah, that's true. Even if you had only cited one person, you would have cited an infinite percent more than they have. Yeah, so
This,
continuing on the comment about Osiris, another text says your loaves are Osiris, consistent with what you just said about it being grain. And then there's a text that says my blood is drunk, even my redness.
yeah, you got drunk. You tried too much wine. That happens. And again, this is not talking about a Eucharist festival. These are cherry picked out of context to make it, just to take the parts that kind of sound like it. But if you read the text these are from and read what scholars say about it, they don't say these kinds of things.
Oh, you have apparently literally quoted nothing since the beginning.
Nothing. I didn't quote Mettinger's book directly. No, definitely not. I don't have it right in front of me here. Here, let me. I can share my screen again here. Let me pull that up here. Share screen. Let's go to here it is. Wait, no, that's Jan Osman. There it is. All right, yeah, here. Sprouting corn symbolizes the resurrection of God. Yeah, because corn refers to grain. Osiris, not from the beginning a genuine god of vegetation, never develops into one. Vegetation for him is a side task. Yeah, this is the book I've read. You can see grain there. It's about Osiris shaped grain seeds spreading up from the cloth. Egyptologists have failed to put on record a fundamental Fraser understanding of Osiris. So again, no connection really to Odinus. Osiris is in fact not a dying god, but a dead god. He never returns among the living. Again, I have all the scholars here, guys. What do you have?
Excellent. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe he meant you haven't cited primary sources, but you did that as well. You took the portion that he cited and then you read the rest of it to show that the context didn't match up.
Oh, they have the Leiden papyrus from the 3rd century AD, yeah.
Let's see. Going back to this, I think we've covered Osiris well
And
enough.
again, yeah, you got to actually show these texts you're saying that Christians were aware of and quoting or using. Okay, if we found, let's say some ancient African deity, like some sort of ancient shrine that was buried for thousands of years, and it mentions this dying and rising God, he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. That does not mean the Christians were borrowing it, because it was lost for all this time. What evidence do we have that Christians were aware of pyramid texts, let alone could read them? So apparently these ancient gospel authors were so intelligent, they could read Persian language. They could read ancient Egyptian pyramid texts. I'm like, oh man, the greatest scholars of the day, could only read a couple of those things if they were good at it. But the Christians, they knew it all, and they were copying left and right.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. In addition to most of these texts not actually being extant at the time, we've rediscovered them since then. They're written in a wide variety of different languages. So, who knows all these ancient languages, in some cases dead languages, by the time the New Testament's being written. So this Fassel asked me to get to this point earlier, so he apparently thinks this is his smoking gun here. Socrates Scholastus recorded a fascinating argument between Christians and Egyptian pagans, who both laid claim to the cross. Quote, when the temple of Serapis was torn down and laid bare, there were found in it engraved on stones certain characters which they call hieroglyphs, having the forms of crosses. Both the Christians and the pagans, on seeing them, appropriated and applied them to their respective religions, for the Christian claimed this character is peculiarly theirs, but the pagans alleged that it might appertain to Christ and Serapis in common.
Yeah. Again, a cross is a very vague symbol, guys. So the text, if you read it, Temple of Serapis talks about the destruction of it. So they go and they find symbols of crosses on there. Again, very vague symbol used in a lot of ancient artwork, used almost everywhere. And basically, he also says that, what is it here? The pagans allege that it might be apparted to Christ or Serapis in common, for they say it symbolizes one thing to Christians and another to the heathens. So in the actual text, he says this has entirely different meaning for pagans and Christians. Symbolizes one thing to Christians, meant an entirely different thing to heathens. So yeah, it was just because you found a very general symbol, that did not mean it meant the same thing to the worshippers of Serapis.
So he did dispute with us on the bread and wine. I didn't read every quote, so this last one he wants us to address. Your eyes are opened like the earth, your limbs are gathered, raise yourself up, when the great bread and this wine like water were given to him. And he says that this is people partaking in the bread and the wine in the name of Osiris.
No, No, this is referring to people, again, continuing, again, as J.Z. Smith Toad said, this is referring to continual existence in the afterlife. It's not about returning to life in this. This is an equivocation fallacy. You're taking what you see as like resurrection or raising up and assuming it had the same meaning for the Egyptians. No evidence it did. And scholars that have read these texts in their original languages and know it well do not say this. They say it refers to continual existence in the afterlife.
Excellent. So this is his last point, summary of his case. Just how did the original message of Jesus transform from pure monotheism of the Old Testament into the paganistic religion of Christianity today? Did early Christians get together and agree on a secret agenda to corrupt the religion and the masses just went along with it? There's no need to resort to conspiracy theories to understand what actually happened. When there are multiple ideologies in the geographic region, you often find that there is an exchange of ideas, and the dominant ideology prevailing in this exchange, this is known as syncretism. And he'll go on a little bit here. But first of all, did Christianity actually change the message of the Old Testament?
No, you can find Trinitarian type language in there. Even Jewish scholars like Benjamin Somers admits. Philo, for example, was a Jew writing that there was like this memra of God that was like equal to him and worked with him in the creation, as well as the spirit of God. Same thing. He was a Jew. He's getting this from the Old Testament. Christians are getting it from the Old Testament. Michael Heiser wrote his dissertation on this, how in Ugaritic mythology, Baal and El rule together, and they're two distinct gods. Well, the early Jews were monotheists, but they had Yahweh in this extension of Yahweh, who was also Yahweh, called the angel of Yahweh, who was sent by God, but also God himself. And so you see this kind of woven throughout the Old Testament. So no, Christians are getting their theology from the Old Testament. They're getting it from the teachings of Jesus. That's where they're getting it from. There's no evidence they're getting this from like, oh man, we got to corrupt the ancient. Like, again, this is not something you're going to find in an academic textbook or paper published in a peer-reviewed journal. No one would say this. No one would say they had a secret agenda to corrupt this is conspiracy theory nonsense that would be laughed out of academia. That's not what the Christians did. You can find what they're getting from the Old Testament, as even Benjamin Somers admit. Read the writings of Philo. There's talk about the Metatron being another being called Yahweh in some early Jewish texts as well. He's supposedly not God, but also called Yahweh in this kind of sense. So there was this ideas there were these multiple beings called Yahweh in the Old Testament. The spirit of Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh, and Yahweh himself. So that kind of stuff.
So speaking of strawmen, Idolbreaker summarizes your criteria as follows. You want to find Christians admitting to using pagan gods. Why would they ever admit that? That seems like a ridiculous standard to hold.
No. I'm saying you've got to find evidence of literary borrowing. We know, for example, when they're quoting or alluding to the Old Testament, because they will allude to Malachi, or they'll quote Ezekiel here, or they'll reference what Moses said here. They don't do that with any other text, pagan text. We know, for example, in Galatians 5, I think it's Paul quotes Aristotle when he says, "Against such things there is no law." That's a direct quote from Aristotle's Politics. So he's using similar language to teach similar ethics that Aristotle taught. Same in Romans 2:15. He's quoting Aristotle there. So we can find quotes like that. We can find, for example, Acts 17, where it says Paul quotes the philosopher Herodotus, or Epimenides later, I think First Titus 1:12. So we can find those. Where are you finding it when it comes to Inanna or Tammuz? Where are these quotes from? So literary borrowing is a good place to go. You got to have similarities beyond just hasty generalizations. And this is why scholars don't take this crap seriously.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and look at the rest of the summary of the argument here. Granted, the people who allow changes to creep into religion are not necessarily doing it for evil intention. It may come about due to pressure from society or ruling authorities.
The ancient Jewish societies were so pressured to adopt pagan stuff. Oh, yeah, it was horrible. Yeah. The Jews, if the Christians took pagan stuff and put in the New Testament, borrowed from pagan dying and rising gods, allegedly, Jews like Trypho would have ate them up. The writings of the Talmud would have eaten them up. They never mentioned that kind of crap because it didn't happen.
Absolutely. It may even seem natural to adopt certain beliefs and practices if culturally that is what a people are used to. Historically, this is what happened with Christianity. Jewish people were initial target audience of the evangelism of Jesus and his disciples. However, they largely rejected Jesus as Messiah. Let's stop right there. What is your opinion? Did the Jewish people almost universally reject Jesus? Did Christianity develop exclusively?
Well, no, there was a lot of Jews that accepted him. Obviously,
Yeah, I mean,
there was a lot of early Christian Jews that accepted him. I mean, just there was also a sect that didn't, and they became Talmudic Judaism today.
And then, ironically, he said that Jesus only gained a sizable following after he ascended to heaven, when the Apostle Paul started to evangelize to Gentiles. If you actually read the Gospels, you'll see he had a large following before he died, and then everyone fell away, which it would be natural when your leader is killed. Anyway, Paul preached a modified version of the message of Jesus that was stripped from its Jewish elements, such as circumcision and keeping the Sabbath. Therefore, this watered-down version appealed to Gentiles who started embracing Paul's teaching in large numbers, culminating in the pagan Roman Empire and eventually adopting Christianity as its official state religion several centuries after Jesus. We need to understand the mindset of the Gentiles who first received Paul's message in order to understand how paganism crept into Christianity. So he says that Paul is contradicting the Jewish message. Do you know offhand how many times Paul quotes the Old Testament?
Yeah, a couple hundred, I believe. I don't know the exact number, but I know in the New Testament there's about over 300 quotes or allusions to the Old Testament. Like that's their source.
And precisely zero to any of these texts that they supposedly were inspired by.
No, I mean, he does quote Aristotle. He's very much, his ethics have been influenced by Aristotle. His ethics, not his theology, though. He's aware of other texts as well. So he was aware of certain pagan texts. He could have quoted them if he was trying to remake Jesus as a pagan image. He doesn't do that. When he's talking about Jesus, his passion, his resurrection, that's always the Old Testament is what he goes to. He never goes to a pagan work. Read it in context. These people have not read it.
When Jewish people heard stories about Jesus performing amazing miracles, they would have understood in the same context as the likes of Moses and other Israelite prophets who were all granted signs and wonders by God. However, such stories about Jesus would have been interpreted very differently by pagan Gentiles. This is illustrated in the New Testament book of Acts, which informs us. In Lystra, there was a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that Paul had done, they shouted the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." So here you go. Here's the proof that the Gentiles corrupted the message of Christianity, turned Jesus into a god, just like they tried to turn Paul into a god.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul corrects him and says, "Don't worship me, worship Jesus. Like, worship the one true God." I mean, it's like, it doesn't work if you don't take the whole story in context, guys.
Absolutely.
And then they throw him out of town. Like, they beat him up and throw him out of town. Like, oh yeah, this is clearly the evidence of them corrupting. I mean, did they read the whole chapter? Like,
I don't know. And last slide, or last quote here. The early church emerged from both Jewish and Gentile worlds, so the Christians had to reconcile the pure monotheism they had inherited from Judaism, which they show is false, with the polytheism they had derived from paganism. And our final quote here, Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century bishop who is venerated as a saint in both the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. He wrote, "For the truth passes in the mean between these two conceptions, destroying each heresy, and yet accepting what is useful from each. The Jewish dogma is destroyed by the acceptance of the word and by the belief in the spirit, while the polytheistic error of the Greek school is made vanish by the unity of the nature, abrogating this imagination of plurality." So there you go. He's saying that Christianity is neither Jewish or pagan. It's a combination of the two.
That's not what he says at all, because he's saying they're rejecting the polytheistic error right here in the quote. The early church fathers were very much like, let's take the philosophy of the Greeks, what we learned from Aristotle and Plato and these guys, and say, hey, what can we get from them? There's these two pillars of like Athens and Jerusalem, and what can we learn from them? But they didn't get theology. They're getting philosophy from there. Ideas about causation, ideas about ethics. This is what they're getting from the Greeks. Just read it in context. Never once does he say they got Christology from the pagans.
Faisal responded that the people in the story we just looked at from Acts, they didn't listen, and they said, "Don't worship me." So apparently you contradicted yourself, because they got mad at Paul for throwing him out for saying, "Don't worship me." And thus, even though Paul was not teaching a polytheistic or even supposedly, according to Faisal, not preaching the deity of Christ, they threw him out, and then they decided to deify Jesus for no apparent reason.
Yeah. Let's just read it in context. Men, why are you doing these things? We are men of nature like you, and we bring good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that in them. Past generations, he allowed the nations to walk in his own ways. He did not leave himself without witness, for he did good things, giving you rains in heavens and fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart, foods and gladness. Even though these words were scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Okay, so no, he says, don't worship me. Like he says, we're men like you. We're not gods. And then he points to, again, they preach Christ again. So what are you talking about? It says the Jews came out from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. When the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city on the next day and went to Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel in that city and made disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we would enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders from them in every church, when prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord, in whom they had believed. So, and by Lord, it's a reference to Christ there, to Jesus. But the Acts refers to Jesus as the Lord. So, again, never. How would you get? Paul directly says, "Do not worship me in this. I'm just a man like you," and then they go preach the gospel. So we know the context of Acts. What are they preaching? That Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is God. So read full Acts.
Yep. His response here is that what he was just trying to argue is that they didn't listen in general, but they did get that a miracle, that Paul had performed a miracle. But again, you're contradicting yourself, Faisal. You tell us that Paul corrupted Christianity, and then you tell us that they didn't listen to the preaching of Paul, and then they somehow got this idea somewhere else. I mean, you're just all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. This is a weird passage to cite to sort of support that.
And one last comment on Gregory. It doesn't say philosophy or ethics. It clearly says dogma. It says the Jewish dogma. He's got you.
They say they reject the Jewish dogma is destroyed. Okay, so the Jewish dogma at the time was the idea that certain dogmatic beliefs about the Messiah hasn't come yet. So there were differences between the Jews and the Christians in terms of dogma, and they rejected that Jewish dogma. That doesn't mean they rejected everything of what the Jews believe. You're generalizing here. You read Gregory Nyssa in context because he affirms things like monotheism, because he says right after this the polytheistic error. He affirms the Old Testament. He affirms a lot of the things that Jews would agree on, but he rejects other Jewish dogmas that he talks about here.
So we'll close out with two comments. We'll go ahead and put this one out just for the heck of it, because he wants to hear your response. So this is a favorite polemic of Muslims. Explain John 17:3 and how we get the Trinity, because Jesus says in John 17:3 that the Father is the only true God.
Yeah, I talked about this in my refuting objections to the Trinity, either part 2 or part 3. I don't have time to go into detail here, but I mean, so see those videos for more where I address this in more detail. Refuting objections to the Trinity, part 2 and part 3. It's in one of those. But no, this is assuming a lot more in there, because Jesus also affirms that he's God throughout this, says, "Who has seen the Father has seen me." You understand the nature of the Trinity. The Trinity is very simple, that the Father is autotheos. He is the center. The Son is begotten of him. The Spirit proceeds from him. So they are contingent on the Father. The aseity only belongs to the Father. Only the Father is ase. And the Son and the Spirit are eternally from the Father, but they are still dependent on him in that sense. So no, it's just noting back that he is the autotheos in here.
Say dogma, you got it. Well, they're rejecting the dogma of the 4th century Judaism, not the dogma of 1st century Judaism. All right.
Now let's not get into details of her.
And I do want to close out on this comment from Kenton Park. So if Christianity is based off paganism, why did Pliny the Younger write a letter to Trajan asking what to do with the Christians, clearly describing them as not worshiping the pagan gods? So I brought this up because we do have evidence that Christians were in fact not borrowing from pagan religions, because one of the most common polemics against Christians was they are atheists because they reject all our gods. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, once again, the fact that this is unanimously rejected by scholars in academia doesn't mean it's wrong, but it should make you pause and go, am I really studying this? I mean, people that spend their lives researching this stuff all don't agree with me. Maybe I should research this a little bit more. Like, let's not just grab a bunch of stuff from a blog I found and copy and paste it in the YouTube comment. Let's actually do some more research here. Because why not read what the scholars say about Tammuz? Like Mark Smith has written a lot, Stephen Langdon, J.D. Smith. Why not read what they have to say about him? Why are you just jumping to these weird assumptions without actually getting scholarly sources to back you?
Yeah, and I'll just add, you need to look at all the evidence. You might think that these things that someone has pulled out and given you to sound convincing in isolation, and maybe if that was all of the evidence, maybe you could make a case. But you need to look at all the evidence. You need to look at all the Egyptian beliefs. You need to look at all the Babylonian beliefs. And you need to look at all the things the Romans were saying about the Christians, what the enemies of Christianity were accusing them of at the time, not just assume because you found a few things which are kind of, sort of, half interesting things that could easily be coincidences. You need to look at all the evidence in totality and draw your conclusion based on that, not cherry-picked verses and things out of context that probably wouldn't even have been known in 1st century Israel.
The idea that Jesus is based on dying and rising gods of the past is like equivalent to ancient alien stuff. It's woo-woo nonsense. It's not taken seriously in academia. You can see books like by Maurice Casey that addresses this. His book on mysticism is pretty good. Again, read Trygve Menninger's book. If you want to know more about dying and rising God motifs, read Mark Smith. And here, I'll put this up here 1 second. Let me pull this up. Oh, here it is. Okay, so here's my series. I go through all these: Attis, Serapis, Buddha, Romulus, Zoroaster.
Yeah.
So
yes, it's up
all
now.
Tammuz.
Sorry.
I got to go on Tammuz, Almoxis, Asclepius, Baal. All these gods right here. So I go through all them all. I don't have the Baal one on here, but I've done that. I just forgot to put on the playlist. So I've got 16 of these. All of these I basically show there's no correlation, and there's a lot of scholarly sources cited in those videos.
Excellent. And Idolbreaker says that he will check those out. And
Cool.
so I hope he actually does that, and I hope that he stops making claims without primary source evidence and stops just repeating things that he read on a blog, because anyone can write anything that isn't evidence that it's actually true. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and especially thank you, Michael Jones. Everyone needs to head over to Inspiring Philosophy and check out his works. He recently posted a documentary on Exodus, which is A+ material. Check that out.
Thank you.
I believe there's 2 more parts of that coming, right?
Yeah, the wandering period will be next, which will show evidence that for the stuff that was happening during the wandering period, like the formation of the Ark of the Covenant, the laying down of the Jewish festivals, it dates to end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, that kind of time. And then I'll do a video on the conquest. And there's going to be a lot of good data on that. I can promise you that. A lot of good data on the conquest.
Excellent. And I think that's probably the second most popular claim of atheists behind these Jesus myth nonsense, is that there's 0 evidence for the Exodus. That's probably the second most.
I got the latest reports on Jericho, and they look nice.
Excellent. Have a great week, everyone. God bless.